Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. This audio uses AI narration to present our original book analysis. Today, we're diving deep into Susan Jacoby's The Age of American Unreason. It's a book, a lot of you have asked us to take a look at. And it's a really fascinating, kind of unsettling look at how critical thinking in America, how it's declined and how anti-intellectualism has, really taken root over time. We're going to cover a lot of ground today, from the early days of the Republic all the way to the digital age.
It's funny. One of the things that really struck me right off the bat was Jacoby's argument that this isn't a new thing at all. She actually takes us all the way back to the 1800s to show us how, even as this young nation was, trying to figure itself out intellectually, the seeds of anti-intellectualism were already there.
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? You'd think, the early years of a nation would be all about embracing knowledge and new ideas. What was happening back then?
Well, you have to remember the context, right? You had this incredible intellectual scene emerging, but at the same time, there was this huge surge in fundamentalist religion, particularly during the Second Great Awakening. And that movement, it really emphasized emotion, personal experience over intellectualism and reason.
Oh, so it's like this clash between faith and reason playing out right from the start. It makes you think about how those two forces, still kind of interact in American society even today.
Absolutely. And Jacoby even brings up Ralph Waldo Emerson, who at the time was urging Americans to, be intellectually independent, think for themselves. It's an interesting thread she weaves into the narrative.
It does feel like almost a counterpoint to what was happening with the Second Great Awakening.
Yeah.
On one hand, this emphasis on religious fervor. And on the other hand, you have this call for independent thought. It's like America was really wrestling with its identity, right?
Exactly. And this struggle, between embracing or rejecting outside influence, it's something that, it continues to play out in American intellectual life even now. For instance, think about it. When America was first finding its feet, there was this feeling that American culture was, in a way, inferior to European culture.
Like an intellectual inferiority complex, almost.
Oh.
That's surprising, given how much emphasis America has always placed on self-reliance, wouldn't you say?
It does seem contradictory, but it was definitely there. And Jacoby suggests that this actually led to a lot of Americans just accepting whatever intellectual trends were coming from Europe, without really questioning them, without forging their own unique path.
Trying to keep up with the Joneses, intellectually, I guess. But, if we fast forward a bit to the Gilded Age, we see another fascinating and kind of disturbing development. The rise of social Darwinism. It's almost hard to believe that this theory actually tried to use Darwin's work on evolution to justify social inequality.
Right. And what's really striking is that it wasn't just, some fringe idea. You had influential figures like Andrew Carnegie, even academics. William Graham Sumner at Yale, they were all using it to shape public perception.
So this wasn't just something whispered in the shadows. It was really embraced by some pretty powerful people. It makes you wonder, though, are there any parallels to this kind of thinking today, like where we see science being used or misused, I guess, to support a particular agenda?
Oh, absolutely. Think about climate change denial or some of the claims that get made about race and intelligence. You see the same kind of thing happening. Data gets cherry-picked. Scientific consensus gets, misrepresented to fit a certain narrative. It's a tactic that's been around forever, it seems.
Which, I guess, is why critical thinking is so important now more than ever. We need to be able to sift through all the noise and figure out what's real, what's not. And it's interesting because Jacoby doesn't just stop there. She takes us through the Red Scare and McCarthyism, and it's a chilling period in American history. To think that intellectuals and artists were persecuted just because they were suspected of being communists is really frightening.
It is. That whole era really shows you how fear and paranoia can be used to silence people, to silence dissent. It's like a societal reflex almost. When people feel threatened, they tend to lash out at anyone they see as different or dangerous.
And that kind of fear-driven suppression of ideas, it really has a chilling effect on intellectual life, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The Red Scare cast a long shadow. It made people hesitant to speak their minds, to explore controversial topics. You can still feel the impact of that today, I think.
And, moving on from that, Jacoby then tackles the 1960s, a decade that's often, romanticized for its counterculture and social progress. But as with everything else, she offers a more nuanced view. She acknowledges the positive changes, but she also points out there were some anti-intellectual currents running beneath the surface there, too.
It's important to remember that every era has its own complexities. And while the 60s did bring about a lot of positive change, Jacoby also highlights the rise of celebrity culture during that time, which sort of shifted the focus from substance to style, which, well, does that sound familiar?
It does. It's like our current obsession with influencers, right?
Yeah.
Where image often seems to be more important than, actual substance or depth. We're quick to idolize anyone with a big platform these days, regardless of what they actually have to say.
It's a really good point. And along with that, in the 60s, you also saw this surge in what's called the conservative counterculture. And they rejected intellectualism completely, saw it as elitist, out of touch with the average American.
So you've got these two seemingly opposite forces, the counterculture and the counterculture, both kind of contributing to this decline in intellectual rigor, but in very different ways. It's almost paradoxical.
It is, and this kind of leads into another crucial point Jacoby makes, the dumbing down of education. She argues that the decline of what she calls middle-brow culture, the erosion of a strong liberal arts education, the shift towards more vocational training, all of that played a role in creating a citizenry that's less informed, less critical. And well, that's something we can dive into a bit more in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm definitely interested to see where this goes. So far, Jacoby seems to be painting a pretty bleak picture of American intellectual history. But where do we go from here? Well, to find out, you'll have to stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive into the Age of American Unreason, where we'll be exploring the impact of the digital age and what it all means for us today.
So, we were talking about this decline in intellectual rigor, this age of unreason, as Jacoby calls it. And, well, I think it's really interesting to see how this plays out in the digital age, right? You've got this landscape where everything is instant, information overload, constant distractions. It's a pretty stark contrast to that world of deep reading and focused thought we were discussing earlier.
It is. And, one of the things that really struck me was how Jacoby connects the decline of print culture, which, we talked about a bit, but the rise of what she calls junk thought online. This idea that, well, this constant influx of information, often without much context or depth, has actually contributed to shorter attention spans and, I don't know, maybe even a decreased capacity for critical thinking.
And it's not even just about the quantity of information, right? It's about how we consume it. We're scrolling through headlines, skimming articles, watching these bite-sized videos. It's all so fragmented, so superficial. And it's hard with that constant bombardment to actually slow down, reflect, and really engage with complex ideas.
Yeah, it's like our brains are almost being rewired for distraction instead of deep thought. We're losing that ability to focus, to grapple with challenging concepts. And it's a shame because, the internet also has this incredible potential, right? It connects us with people all over the world, gives us access to so much information. How do we reconcile those two sides of the digital coin?
That is the challenge, isn't it? Because the internet can be an amazing tool for learning, for connection, but it also creates this breeding ground for misinformation, for shallow thinking. We need to be really mindful of how we use it and actively try to cultivate those critical thinking skills.
So it's about taking ownership of our digital consumption. Not just passively absorbing whatever comes our way, but actually being discerning, questioning what we read, what we hear, seeking out diverse perspectives, and really engaging in thoughtful discussions online.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that the internet, it doesn't absolve us of the responsibility to think critically. If anything, it makes that responsibility even more crucial. And, one of the things that Jacoby argues exacerbates this is the decline of middle-brow culture that we touched on a little earlier.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. How do you see that connection playing out?
Well, middle-brow culture with things like book clubs and lectures, magazines, it sort of provided this bridge between highbrow intellectualism and popular culture, right? It offered people a way to engage with complex ideas without feeling intimidated or excluded. And its decline has left this void, in our cultural landscape. It makes it so much harder to sift through all this information and figure out what's quality, what's just noise.
It's like we've lost a common ground for intellectual discourse. We're just stuck in these echo chambers, surrounded by information that just confirms what we already believe, or we're just feeling lost, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of everything out there. So where do we go from here? How do we navigate this age of unreason and create a more informed, more engaged society? Is there hope for revival of critical thinking in this digital age?
That's the question we're going to grapple with in the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore what Jacoby has to say about what we can do both individually and collectively to reclaim intellectual rigor and navigate this challenging but ultimately exciting new landscape.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into the Age of American Unreason, I keep coming back to this idea of, like, reclaiming intellectual rigor. It feels kind of daunting, especially today where everything's so fast-paced and fragmented.
Yeah, I get that. And Jacoby does paint a pretty sobering picture. But the book isn't meant to be all doom and gloom. It's really a call to action, a challenge to reclaim that intellectual curiosity, to engage in more thoughtful discourse, both online and offline.
So where do we even start with that? I mean, it's kind of overwhelming to think about tackling this Age of Unreason at a societal level.
Well, it can feel that way, but really change starts with each of us. Like, we can each decide to engage with complex ideas, to challenge our own assumptions, to seek out those different perspectives.
It's about cultivating that intellectual curiosity.
Right.
Right. Not just settling for those easy answers or passively taking in whatever's thrown at us.
Exactly. And it's not just about consuming information either. It's about creating it too. Writing, engaging in those debates, even just having those deeper conversations with friends and family. All those things, they push back against that tide of unreason.
Jacoby also talks about the role of education in all this. She seems to be pretty concerned about, the decline of the liberal arts and, the focus on vocational training instead. She argues that it's, created a citizenry that's less informed, less critical.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue, and there's definitely value in vocational training, for sure. But Jacoby's point is that, a well-rounded education, one that exposes people to different fields, different ways of thinking, that's crucial for a healthy democracy.
It's about giving people the tools they need to navigate this world, to separate fact from fiction, to engage in those debates in a thoughtful way. And it's about fostering that love of learning that goes beyond the classroom,
Absolutely. And even though the traditional systems might be struggling to keep up, there are new ways to learn, to engage with ideas. Look at all the online learning platforms popping up, podcasts like ours, even the comeback of independent bookstores.
That's encouraging. Those little signs of hope, those pockets of resistance against this age of unreason, gives me hope that we can turn things around.
We can. We have to. Like Jacoby reminds us, the future of a reasoned, informed society really depends on it.
Yeah.
So to everyone listening, we encourage you to dive deeper into Jacoby's The Age of American Unreason yourself. You can find a link to purchase the book in our show notes. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand what's shaping our society and contribute to a more reasoned, informed public discourse. And don't forget to subscribe to Mindful Moments for more insightful book analyses delivered straight to your ears. Keep those minds engaged because the future of reason, it depends on it.